Long before any sword was raised or arrow loosed, a medieval battle had already begun in quieter, less heroic ways. It started with hunger, with aching feet, with the slow movement of men across muddy roads. Most medieval battles were not sudden explosions of violence, but the end result of weeks or months of exhausting preparation. Armies did not simply appear on open fields. They trudged there, following wagons of grain, barrels of ale, herds of cattle driven forward like reluctant supplies. Soldiers slept in fields, barns, and ditches, wrapped in damp cloaks that never quite dried. Many had already been sick for days before seeing an enemy. The army itself was not a single unified force. It was a collection of groups knights with their personal retinues, mercenaries hired for coin, local peasants pressed into service, archers recruited from towns, men with different dialects, loyalties, and levels of training. Some were eager, dreaming of glory or plunder. Others were terrified, counting the days until they could return home. Discipline varied wildly. Commanders issued orders, but once battle began, control often dissolved into chaos. Armor was heavy and uncomfortable. Mail shirts dug into shoulders. Helmets trapped heat and sweat, turning breathing into labor. Padding underneath absorbed sweat and grime until it stank. Weapons were practical tools, not elegant cymbal spears. Billhooks, axes, bows, crossbows, swords carried more as backup than primary weapons. Contrary to modern imagination, swords were not the centerpiece of battle. They were sidearms, used when formations broke and fighting became close and desperate. As armies approached each other, the landscape mattered enormously. Commanders looked for high ground, narrow passes, river crossings. A muddy slope could kill more men than enemy blades. Rain could turn fields into traps where soldiers slipped, fell, and were trampled by their own comrades. Battles were often delayed for days as each side maneuvered, trying to force the other into a disadvantage. The night before battle was rarely dramatic. There were no grand speeches echoing across camps. Instead, there was silence broken by coughing, muttered prayers, sharpening stones scraping against steel. Men thought of their families, of unfinished harvests, of debts and promises. Some confessed sins to priests, others drank heavily, hoping to numb fear. Sleep came poorly, interrupted by dreams of noise and blood. When morning arrived, it did not bring clarity. It brought fog, cold, and confusion. Armor was donned slowly, straps tightened with clumsy fingers. Banners were raised not for inspiration but for identification, because once battle began, knowing where your own side stood could mean survival. Units formed up unevenly, lines bending and shifting as men jostled for position. Commands were shouted, repeated, misunderstood. The opening moments of battle were often the most controlled, and yet the most tense. Archers stepped forward first, planting stakes or kneeling behind shields. Crossbowmen wound their weapons slowly, each turn of the crank a reminder of how mechanical and impersonal death could be. When the signal finally came, it was rarely dramatic: a horn blast, a raised banner, a shouted command carried unevenly by the wind. Arrows rose into the sky in dark clouds, not aimed at individuals but at masses. They fell unpredictably, thudding into shields, armor, flesh, and earth. Some men died instantly, pierced through the eye or throat. Others screamed, wounded but alive, lying helpless as the battle moved past them. The noise began to build, not a single roar, but thousands of small sounds layered together. The snap of bowstrings, the clang of metal, the cries of the injured. As missile fire continued, infantry began to advance. Not charging wildly, but moving cautiously, trying to maintain formation. Shields overlapped. Spears angled forward. The ground between armies felt impossibly long, each step filled with dread. Men tripped over rocks, over bodies already fallen. When the lines finally met, the impact was not a clean clash but a grinding collision. This was where medieval battles were truly decided, not in elegant duels, but in crushing pressure. Soldiers shoved against each other, shield to shield, trying to force gaps. Spears stabbed blindly into faces, bellies, thighs. Men fell, and when they fell, they became obstacles. Stepping over a fallen comrade meant risking balance, risking exposure. Many deaths came not from direct blows, but from being knocked down and unable to rise. The air became thick with sweat and breath. Helmets fogged with condensation. Vision narrowed to what was directly in front. Commands from officers became meaningless noise. Units dissolved into clusters, clusters into individuals fighting for survival. Fear was constant, overwhelming, but training and instinct kept men moving. Stopping meant death. Knights did not dominate the battlefield as legends suggest. Heavy cavalry could be devastating in the right conditions, but they were vulnerable too. Horses panicked. Riders fell. A knight on the ground was just another man, weighed down by armor, struggling to rise while enemies closed in. Many were killed not in glorious charges, but while trapped, suffocating beneath their own equipment. Wounds were ugly and often fatal even when not immediately deadly. A cut to the leg could mean infection. A crushed hand could end a life slowly. Blood soaked into clothing, making armor slippery and difficult to grip. Pain was intense but often delayed. Adrenaline carried men forward long after they should have collapsed. As time passed, exhaustion became the true enemy. Arms shook from repeated blows. Breathing turned ragged. Men leaned on their shields between clashes, desperately hoping the line would hold. Battles could last hours, sometimes all day, but most men experienced it as a blur, moments of terror separated by confusion and noise. Eventually, something broke. It was rarely the death of a commander or a single dramatic moment. More often, it was fatigue, fear, or the realization that the line next to you was thinning. When one group began to retreat, even slowly, panic spread. Medieval armies did not retreat gracefully. Retreat became flight. This was when the killing became worst. A fleeing soldier dropped his shield, his helmet, anything to run faster. He was vulnerable, exposed. Pursuers cut down men from behind, stabbed through backs and necks. Horses trampled the fallen. Many who survived the main battle died during the rout. Surrender was dangerous but sometimes possible. High-status prisoners might be spared for ransom. Common soldiers were less fortunate. Mercy depended on discipline, leadership, and sheer luck. Some battlefields turned into massacres. Others ended more quietly, with scattered survivors hiding in woods or fields until nightfall. When the fighting finally stopped, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Bodies lay everywhere, twisted, broken, stripped of valuables. The wounded cried for help, for water, for mercy. Some were aided by priests or surgeons, others left to die slowly. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of blood, sweat, excrement, and churned earth. Victory did not feel triumphant. The survivors were numb, exhausted, often grieving. Friends and relatives lay dead nearby. Armor was removed with shaking hands. Weapons were cleaned mechanically, without thought. Fires were lit, not for celebration, but for warmth and cooking whatever food remained. In the days that followed, the true cost of battle became clear. Disease spread among the wounded. Infections claimed lives that blades had spared. Graves were dug hastily, often shallow. Sometimes bodies were burned. Sometimes they were left where they fell, especially after large battles, to be picked over by animals. For those who returned home, the battle never truly ended. Injuries lingered, nightmares followed. Many medieval soldiers carried scars both visible and invisible. Glory faded quickly, replaced by the need to farm fields, repay debts, and rebuild lives interrupted by violence. What actually happened in a medieval battle was not heroism frozen in time, not shining armor and noble charges. It was confusion, fear, exhaustion, and endurance. It was ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances, doing what they had to in order to survive. It was loud, dirty, terrifying, and deeply human. And when the banners were folded and the field fell silent, the world moved on, leaving behind only stories often cleaned, simplified, and romanticized, while the reality remained buried beneath the soil, alongside those who never returned. The silence that followed a medieval battle was never truly silent. Even after the last clash of steel had faded and the survivors had staggered away, the field itself seemed alive with sound. There was the low moaning of the wounded, some calling for God, some for their mothers, some making noises that no longer sounded human at all. Flies gathered quickly, drawn by blood and exposed flesh, forming dark clouds that buzzed constantly over the dead and dying. Ravens and crows circled overhead, already claiming ownership of what remained. Those who could still walk were put to work almost immediately. There was no time to process what had happened. Helmets were removed from the fallen, sometimes gently, sometimes with brutal efficiency if straps were stuck. Weapons were collected, not as trophies but as necessities. A usable sword or spear could be worth more than a man's wages for months. Boots were stripped from corpses, belts cut away, purses taken. This was not considered dishonorable, it was survival. The dead no longer needed these things, the living did. Surgeons and barber surgeons moved among the wounded with knives already stained dark. Their knowledge was limited, their tools crude, but they worked quickly. An arrow that could not be removed cleanly was often snapped off, the shaft left inside. Limbs crushed beyond saving were amputated without hesitation. There was no anesthesia beyond alcohol, prayer, and sheer endurance. Some men passed out from pain, others died screaming. Infection would claim many more in the days ahead, regardless of skill or luck. Commanders counted survivors, not bodies. They needed to know how many men could still fight, how many could march. A victorious army that was too damaged might still be forced to retreat. A defeated force that retained enough cohesion might regroup and strike again. Medieval warfare did not end neatly with a single battle, even when one side clearly won the field. News of the battle spread slowly. Messengers rode out, carrying exaggerated accounts of bravery and villainy. By the time word reached distant towns, the story had already changed. Losses were minimized. Victories were magnified. The truth that most men had fought out of fear, confusion, and desperation was rarely told. For the common soldier, there was no grand reward waiting. Pay was often delayed or never delivered at all. Promises made before the battle were forgotten in the chaos afterward. Some men deserted quietly, slipping away at night, choosing the uncertainty of life as a fugitive over the certainty of another battle. Others stayed, bound by obligation, lack of alternatives, or simple exhaustion. The battlefield itself remained dangerous long after the fighting stopped. Wounded men sometimes rose suddenly, striking out in panic. Unexploded anger lingered, old grudges resurfaced. Looting could turn violent, as men fought over armor, weapons, or prisoners worth ransoming. Discipline, already fragile, was at its weakest after battle. When armies moved on, they left scars on the land. Crops were trampled, villages were stripped of food. Livestock was taken or slaughtered. Civilians suffered quietly, often more than the soldiers themselves. For them, the battle was not a single terrible day, but the beginning of hunger, disease, and displacement that could last for years. Those who survived and returned home carried the battlefield with them. Injuries healed poorly. A man who had lost fingers could no longer farm effectively. A crushed knee might mean a lifetime of pain. Many veterans found themselves dependent on family or charity. Their usefulness diminished in societies that valued physical labor above all else. Memory itself became a burden. The noise of battle returned in dreams. The smell of blood lingered in the mind. Sudden sounds caused flinching. Medieval people did not have words for trauma as we understand it today, but they recognized its presence. Chronic fear, violence, and grief shaped lives quietly, deeply. And yet, despite all of this, battles continued. Lords raised armies again. Attachment to honor, territory, and power outweighed the suffering of those who fought. Each new generation learned the same brutal lessons, often too late. Medieval warfare persisted not because it was glorious, but because it was embedded in the structure of society itself. What actually happened in a medieval battle was not a single moment of heroism, frozen in art or song. It was a long chain of hardship that began before the first arrow flew and continued long after the last sword was sheathed. It was hunger and fear, mud and blood, exhaustion and survival. It was ordinary men enduring extraordinary violence, leaving behind fields that would remember them long after their names were forgotten. And when the grass finally grew back, and the plow passed over ground that once ran red, the earth kept its secrets. Only fragments remained, rusted blades, broken bones, stories told and retold until they no longer resembled the truth. What truly happened lived on not in legend, but in silence, buried beneath centuries of soil and time. Years later, sometimes decades later, those same fields were walked again by people who had no idea what had happened there. Children chased each other through tall grass. Farmers dug furrows and occasionally struck something hard, a blade edge, dulled by time, a rusted buckle, a fragment of bone. These things were pulled from the earth, examined briefly, then often discarded. The land had a way of swallowing history, smoothing it over, turning violence into quiet ground once more. But in the medieval world, memory did not disappear so easily. Survivors spoke, though rarely in full detail. Around hearth fires and tavern tables, battles were reduced to moments that could be explained without reopening wounds. A charge that succeeded, a banner that fell. A lord who fled or stood firm. These stories were shaped carefully, not to tell the truth, but to make sense of what had happened. Fear and confusion were replaced with purpose. Random survival was recast as courage or divine favor. Clergy offered another explanation. Victory meant God's approval. Defeat meant punishment or testing. This framework helped people endure what would otherwise feel meaningless. Men who had watched friends die for reasons they did not understand could accept suffering more easily if it served a higher plan. Faith became a shield where armor had failed. Nobles commissioned songs and chronicles that emphasized bravery and honor. Minstrels sang of knights meeting in single combat, of noble sacrifices and glorious deaths. These performances were not lies exactly, but they were selective truths. They ignored the press of bodies, the filth, the screams, the panic. The audience wanted heroes, not exhaustion. They wanted meaning, not mud. Meanwhile, the realities of battle shaped military practice quietly and pragmatically. Commanders learned that holding formation mattered more than individual skill. That fatigue destroyed armies faster than swords, that supply lines were as deadly as any enemy. These lessons were learned through loss, through trial, through watching men break under pressure. There was no formal theory, no manuals widely shared, only experience passed from veteran to veteran. Weapons evolved not toward elegance, but efficiency. Armor thickened where blows most often landed. Polearms became more common because they worked. Missile troops were valued because they killed without risking close contact. None of this was romantic. It was practical, shaped by bloodshed. The men who fought in medieval battles rarely saw themselves as part of history. They thought in terms of days and meals, of surviving the next march, the next clash. A battle was not a turning point to them. It was something to endure. If they lived, they returned to their lives altered but moving forward. If they died, they disappeared into statistics that were rarely even recorded accurately. For every famous medieval battle remembered by name, there were dozens forgotten entirely. Small engagements, border skirmishes, failed sieges, ambushes on forest roads. These were no less brutal, no less terrifying. They simply lacked chroniclers, lacked nobles important enough to make the outcome worth preserving. The majority of medieval warfare vanished into obscurity almost immediately. Even victory carried its own quiet horror. Winning meant occupying land filled with grieving families. It meant enforcing rule over people who remembered burned homes and stolen food. Soldiers became garrisons, watching for rebellion, dealing with resentment. Violence did not end, it changed form. The battlefield extended into daily life. As time passed, the veterans aged, scars stiffened. Old wounds reopened in winter. Some found purpose in training younger men, passing on hard-earned knowledge. Others withdrew, becoming silent figures on the edge of villages, respected but not truly understood. The young listened to their stories with fascination, not realizing that fascination would someday become fear. And then, inevitably, another war came. Another call to arms. Another generation stepped forward, believing because everyone always believes that this time would be different. That courage would be enough. That skill would matter. That they would be the ones who came home unchanged. What actually happened in a medieval battle was not confined to a single day of fighting. It echoed forward, shaping lives, lands, and memories. It left marks on bodies and minds, on traditions and tactics. It taught lessons that were rarely spoken aloud, lessons written instead in scars and silence. And if you stood alone on a medieval battlefield, long after the armies had gone, you would feel none of the glory sung in songs. You would feel only the weight of what had happened there, the sense that the ground itself had witnessed something terrible and unforgettable. The earth would be quiet, but it would not be empty. It would remember. Even centuries later, that memory lingered in subtle ways. Roads curved slightly where mass graves lay beneath, avoided not by conscious knowledge but by habit passed down through generations. Place names survived, fields called Dead Man's Meadow, hills known as Bloody Ridge. Labels spoken casually by people who no longer remembered why they existed. Language itself carried traces of old violence, worn smooth by time. Medieval battles also shaped law and power in ways ordinary people rarely saw directly. A lord who won could rewrite obligations, raise rents, demand new labor. A lord who lost might vanish entirely, his lands redistributed, his people suddenly serving a new master with unfamiliar rules. To peasants, these changes felt arbitrary, but they were born on battlefields far away. Steel decided who held authority, even if the consequences arrived quietly months later. The psychological divide between those who had fought and those who had not grew wider with age. Veterans recognized each other without words in the way they stood, in how they scanned crowds, in how quickly their hands moved toward knives when voices rose. They carried a knowledge that could not be taught, how quickly order collapsed, how thin the line was between standing firm and running. This knowledge rarely brought pride. It brought caution. Religion continued to provide comfort, but it also absorbed the violence. Churches displayed banners captured in battle. Armor was donated and hung near altars. Prayers were said for souls lost in combat, often without names. War became woven into worship, not celebrated, but accepted as part of the world's broken nature. Their games mirrored the stories, not the reality. No one taught them about the smell, the weight, the fear. That education came later, abruptly, when play turned into obligation. From a distance, medieval battles might appear slow and primitive compared to modern warfare, but to those inside them, they were overwhelming. There was no escape from the sensory assault. No way to step back and observe. Every decision was immediate and final. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of moving despite it, often without understanding why. As generations passed, armor rusted away, weapons broke down, bones returned to soil. The real medieval battle, complex and chaotic, resisted neat explanation. It did not fit comfortably into legend. What actually happened was this: men walked into uncertainty because they were told to, because they felt they had no choice, because society demanded it. They fought not for abstract ideals, but for survival, loyalty, fear of punishment, hope of reward. They endured noise, pain, confusion, and loss that reshaped them forever. And when it was over, when the shouting stopped and the banners came down, there was no clean ending. Life resumed around the damage. Fields were replanted. Children were born. Stories were told. The battle faded, but never fully disappeared. That is what actually happened in a medieval battle, not a single dramatic moment, but a long human experience stretching before and after the clash itself. A story written in effort rather than glory, remembered imperfectly, and carried forward in quiet ways by a world that learned again and again how much war cost and how easily it returned. Over time, the distance between the reality of medieval battle and the way it was remembered grew wider. Each retelling smoothed the rough edges a little more. Fear became bravery. Confusion became strategy. Survival became victory. This was not done out of deceit, but out of necessity. A world that constantly revisited the full horror of its wars would struggle to function. Memory softened violence so society could endure it. Yet the body did not forget as easily as stories did. Old soldiers felt the weather in their bones. Rain brought back the ache of mud-soaked armor and numb fingers. Thunder echoed too closely to the sound of drums and clashing steel. Some men avoided crowds for the rest of their lives, unsettled by noise and movement. Others sought them out, uncomfortable in silence, needing distraction from their thoughts. The skills learned on the battlefield rarely translated well into peaceful life. A man trained to react instantly to threats might struggle with patience. Quick anger, sudden violence, and deep withdrawal were common, even if they went unnamed. Communities accepted these behaviors as the cost of war, offering tolerance where they could, fear where they could not. Women bore their own share of the aftermath. They waded through campaigns with no certainty of return. They raised children alone, managed farms, and prepared for grief without knowing when it would arrive. After battles, they tended wounds, buried the dead, and absorbed survivors back into households forever changed. Their labor and resilience made recovery possible, though it was rarely acknowledged. Economically, battles left long shadows. A region that lost too many men might struggle for generations. Fewer hands meant smaller harvests, higher prices, and deeper poverty. Lords responded by demanding more from those who remained, increasing pressure rather than easing it. War fed upon itself, creating conditions that made future conflict more likely. Even kings and nobles, often portrayed as distant architects of war, were shaped by battle's reality. Those who had fought learned caution or cruelty depending on what they survived. Some became obsessed with preparation, stronger castles, larger armies, harsher laws. Others avoided open conflict whenever possible, haunted by memories they could not publicly admit. Technology changed slowly, but mentality changed slower still. Despite repeated evidence that war brought suffering more reliably than reward, medieval society accepted it as inevitable. Honor culture, inheritance laws, and religious justification formed a framework that made violence feel normal, even righteous. To question war itself was to question the structure of the world. And so medieval battles continued to occur not because people misunderstood their cost, but because they believed there was no alternative. Power was defended with force. Disputes were settled with blood. Peace was temporary, fragile, always waiting to be broken by ambition or fear. If one could stand outside time and observe a medieval battle without legend or distance, the most striking feature would not be the violence, but the vulnerability. Armor could fail. Formations could break. Courage could vanish in a heartbeat. The men involved were never invincible figures. They were fragile bodies relying on discipline, luck, and the hope that the line would hold just a little longer. That vulnerability is what connects medieval battle to all warfare that followed. The weapons change, the tactics evolve, but the human experience remains familiar. Confusion, fear, exhaustion, loss, the quiet afterward. The struggle to explain it to those who were not there. So when we ask what actually happened in a medieval battle, the answer is not found only in tactics or timelines. It is found in the long, unbroken human experience that began before the first march and continued long after the last grave was filled. It is found in the way war reshaped lives in ways no song could fully capture. The medieval battlefield was not a stage for glory. It was a place where ordinary people confronted the limits of endurance and where survival itself became the only true victory. As the years accumulated, the medieval world learned to live with the expectation of battle, the way it learned to live with famine or plague. It was not a constant presence, but it was always possible, always close enough to shape decisions. Villages kept tools that could become weapons. Town walls were maintained even in times of peace. Young men grew up knowing that one day, they might be called to leave everything behind and walk toward violence they could not imagine. Preparation for battle became woven into everyday life. Training was informal but persistent. Boys wrestled, threw stones, practiced with bows when they could. Not because they dreamed of war, but because everyone understood its likelihood. A man unprepared was a liability, not just to himself but to those standing beside him. Survival depended on the weakest link holding long enough for the line to endure. And still, when the moment came, nothing truly prepared anyone. The first battle was always a shock. The body reacted before the mind could catch up. Hands shook, mouths went dry. Time seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably. Veterans recognized this look immediately in new recruits, the wide eyes, the stiff movements, the forced confidence. They knew how quickly it would be stripped away. What made medieval battles especially unforgiving was the lack of distance. Killing happened face to face. You saw the person you struck. You heard their breath, their cries, felt their weight when they fell. This intimacy left marks that lasted longer than scars. It complicated ideas of enemy and justice. A man killed not a symbol or a banner, but another human being who had likely been just as afraid. Yet hatred still flourished. It was easier than fear. Easier than empathy. Commanders encouraged it, because hatred pushed men forward when reason told them to run. Songs and speeches painted enemies as monsters, heretics, animals. Dehumanization was a weapon as real as any blade, dulling hesitation and guilt. After battle, that hatred often evaporated, leaving confusion in its place. Prisoners sat quietly, suddenly ordinary. The dead looked no different than fallen friends once helmets were removed. Many soldiers struggled with this contradiction, though few had the language to express it. They carried it silently, adding another unseen weight to their lives. The land itself bore witness repeatedly. Some regions saw battle after battle, generation after generation. Fields were fought over so often that local people learned where to hide instinctively. Woods became refuges. Caves, marshes, and hills provided temporary safety. Civilians developed their own survival strategies, separate from the ambitions of lords and kings. In this way, medieval battles shaped not just soldiers, but entire cultures. Caution became tradition. Distrust became wisdom. Hospitality coexisted with suspicion. People learned to read signs, unfamiliar banners, unusual troop movements, sudden demands for supplies. Early warning meant survival. Despite everything, life continued. Festivals returned. Markets reopened. Weddings were held. Laughter existed alongside memory. This was not denial, but resilience. Medieval people understood, perhaps better than we do, that waiting for the world to become safe was futile. One lived where one could, while one could. When chroniclers later tried to capture battles in writing, they struggled. Numbers were guessed. Timelines blurred. Motivations were simplified. The chaos resisted structure. What survived on the page was an echo, not the event itself. The lived experience remained trapped within those who had been there, and eventually, even they were gone. The last witness died. The last first-hand memory vanished. All that remained were objects in the ground, words and manuscripts, and landscapes shaped subtly by what had occurred. The battle became history, then legend, then curiosity. But if history teaches anything through medieval battles, it is this: war is never contained by the moment of fighting. It spreads outward in time and consequence. It reshapes societies long after swords are set aside. It becomes part of how people think, plan, fear, and hope. So what actually happened in a medieval battle cannot be confined to the clash of arms. It happened in the march toward the field, in the hesitation before advancing, in the terror of contact, in the exhaustion afterward, and in the quiet years that followed. It happened in the bodies of survivors, in the absences left behind, in the land itself. And that truth, more than any tale of glory or honor, is what defines the medieval battlefield, not as a place of legend, but as a human experience repeated countless times, endured rather than celebrated, and remembered imperfectly by a world that could never fully escape it. With time, even the institutions built to manage war became shaped by the memory of past battles. Laws governing levies, ransoms, and conduct in war were not born from ideals, but from painful experience. Rules about who could be taken prisoner, how long service lasted, and what obligations lords owed their men all existed because, at some point, chaos had proven too costly. Medieval warfare was brutal, but it was not mindless. It was constantly adjusted by the quiet lessons learned in blood. Training slowly became more deliberate. Veteran soldiers were valued not for their strength alone, but for their steadiness. A man who could keep formation when fear surged was worth more than one who struck hardest. Commanders learned to watch morale as closely as numbers. A hungry army was a fragile army. An unpaid army was a dangerous one. These truths were never written formally, but they were understood deeply. Still, no amount of experience could eliminate chance. A stumble in the mud, a snapped strap, an arrow loosed blindly into smoke, these small random moments decided lives and sometimes entire campaigns. Medieval battles were shaped as much by accident as by intention. This randomness made them terrifying. You could do everything right and still die. You could make mistakes and live. Survival was not proof of virtue or skill. It was often proof of luck. This unpredictability fed superstition. Soldiers carried charms, relics, scraps of saints' clothing sewn into tunics. They whispered prayers before stepping forward. Some believed certain days were cursed, certain omens decisive. A sudden wind shift, a bird flying low, a weapon dropped before battle, these signs mattered because they offered a sense of control in a world that offered very little. Before battle, armies sometimes waited for hours, even days, facing each other across open ground. This waiting was often worse than the fighting itself. Muscles tightened. Thoughts spiraled. Men imagined every possible outcome. When fighting finally began, it came as both terror and relief. At least uncertainty was replaced by action. During the clash, time behaved strangely. Some moments stretched endlessly, the slow rise of an enemy spear, the weight of a shield pressed into your chest. Other moments vanished completely, lost to adrenaline and shock. Many survivors could not recall large portions of the battle afterward. Memory fractured under stress, preserving sensations rather than sequences. Sound was overwhelming. Not the clean clash heard in films, but a layered roar, Metal on metal, wood splintering, men shouting incoherently, wounded animals screaming, commanders yelling orders no one could hear. The noise alone exhausted men, drained focus, and deepened panic. Silence afterward felt unnatural, almost threatening. Smell was inescapable, sweat trapped under armor, blood warming in the sun, open bowels from fatal wounds, smoke from fires and gunpowder in later periods. These smells clung to clothing and hair long after battle ended, making it impossible to forget where one had been. As fighting wore on, individuality dissolved. You stopped thinking of yourself as a person and became part of a moving mass. Decisions were reduced to simple choices: push or fall back, strike or block, stand or run. There was no room for reflection. Thought itself became dangerous. Those who broke and fled often carried shame heavier than any wound. Cowardice was feared not just because it endangered others, but because it followed a man home. Reputation mattered deeply in medieval society. A single moment of flight could define a life. And yet, many who ran did so not from weakness, but from overwhelming fear that no human was built to withstand for long. After the battle, explanations were constructed quickly. Commanders justified decisions. Survivors compared stories, unconsciously aligning them. Contradictions were smoothed out. Gaps were filled. This process was not dishonest, it was human. Chaos demanded order, even if that order was artificial. Over years, these explanations hardened into accepted truth. Children learned about battles as clean events with clear causes and outcomes. The messy reality faded. Only those who had been there knew how incomplete these stories were, and most of them eventually stopped trying to explain. Archaeology, centuries later, would rediscover fragments of the truth, skeletons with unhealed wounds, weapons broken in ways no ceremonial use would explain, mass graves hastily dug. These silent witnesses confirmed what stories had hidden: that medieval battles were not neat, not noble, not controlled. They were human catastrophes repeated again and again because no one could imagine a world without them. And yet, from within that world, people still hoped. They hoped each battle would be the last. They hoped victory would bring stability. They hoped sacrifice would mean something lasting. These hopes were not foolish. They were necessary. Without them, no one would have walked onto those fields at all. So when we ask what actually happened in a medieval battle, the truest answer may be this: people endured something they were never meant to endure, again and again, and somehow continued living afterward. They adapted, they remembered selectively, they rebuilt. They carried on not because war made sense, but because life demanded it. The medieval battlefield was not a place of answers. It was a place of limits, of strength, of courage, of endurance. And every time it was crossed, those limits were tested, broken, and quietly redefined by the people who survived to walk away. As the centuries passed, the pattern repeated with weary familiarity. One battle faded into memory just in time for another to take its place. Names changed, banners changed, causes shifted, but the experience remained strikingly consistent. The medieval battlefield became a kind of grim constant, an event people prepared for, feared, survived, and then folded back into ordinary life as best they could. What is often forgotten is how rarely medieval battles were decisive in the way later history suggests. A single clash seldom ended a war outright. Instead, it rearranged momentum. It weakened one side, emboldened the other, altered negotiations. War dragged on through raids, sieges, skirmishes, and starvation. The battle was just the most visible, most concentrated moment of suffering within a much longer process. For soldiers, this meant that even surviving a major battle did not guarantee safety. Wounded men were vulnerable during marches. Armies harassed retreating forces relentlessly. Camps were attacked at night. Disease spread more efficiently than any enemy weapon. Dysentery, typhus, and fever killed thousands who had survived the fighting itself. In many campaigns, more men died after battles than during them. This reality deepened the sense of fatalism. Medieval soldiers often believed their fate was already decided, written by God or fortune. This belief could bring comfort or despair, sometimes both at once. If death was inevitable, fear lost some of its power. If survival was arbitrary, effort could feel meaningless. Men oscillated between grim acceptance and fierce determination, sometimes within the same hour. Commanders, too, were trapped by these contradictions. They were expected to be decisive, confident, almost prophetic. yet they knew how fragile control truly was. A sudden storm could ruin a plan, a misheard order could collapse a flank. Leadership was less about commanding every movement, and more about holding an army together long enough for chance to favor them. The idea of honor, so central to medieval warfare, was itself shaped by these limits. Honor was not just about bravery. It was about endurance, loyalty, and restraint. A man who held his place despite terror was honorable. A commander who avoided unnecessary slaughter could be honorable. Even retreat, when done to preserve forces, could be framed as honorable. These flexible definitions were not hypocrisy, they were adaptations to reality. After battles, rituals helped people cope. Prayers were said for the dead. Victories were attributed to divine will. Defeats were explained as moral lessons. These rituals did not erase grief, but they gave it shape. They turned private pain into shared meaning, allowing communities to move forward together. Time softened even the sharpest memories. Survivors grew older, their stories shorter. Details faded, leaving impressions rather than images. Fear became caution. Horror became wisdom. Many veterans became deeply religious later in life, not out of sudden piety, but because faith offered a language for experiences that otherwise had none. The land continued its quiet work of erasure. Grass grew, rivers shifted, villages were rebuilt. What had once been a field of bodies became pasture again. This transformation was not disrespectful, it was necessary. Life required space, and memory alone could not hold the ground forever. Yet traces remained. Not just in artifacts or bones, but in patterns of settlement, in road placements, in the cautious spacing of farms. Even laughter carried echoes. Humor about death, injury, and hardship was common in medieval communities, not because people were cruel, but because humor dulled fear. It made the unbearable survivable. Looking back now, it is tempting to search medieval battles for lessons, strategies, or moral clarity. But their most important truth is simpler and more unsettling. They reveal how ordinary people respond when pushed beyond ordinary limits. How quickly ideals bend. How strongly humans cling to meaning when chaos threatens to overwhelm it. What actually happened in a medieval battle cannot be captured fully by numbers or tactics. It happened in the tightening of a grip on a spear. In the decision to take one more step forward. In the moment a man chose to help a fallen enemy or chose not to. It happened in exhaustion, in fear, in fleeting acts of kindness, and terrible acts of violence. And when it was over, it happened again in the telling, the remembering, the forgetting. The battle lived on not just as an event, but as a shaping force, influencing how people understood power, faith, community, and themselves. In the end, medieval battles were not about glory or destiny. They were about endurance in a world that offered little mercy. They were about surviving one day so that life, in all its fragile ordinariness, could continue the next. That is what actually happened. And even as life continued, the shadow of battle lingered in ways so ordinary they were rarely noticed. A farmer choosing not to cultivate a certain patch of land because plowing there always turned up iron. A shepherd avoiding a low hill where animals refused to graze. A village fair held a little farther from the old road than seemed necessary. These were not conscious memorials, but inherited instincts, quiet acknowledgments that some places carried weight. The medieval mind did not separate war from life as cleanly as we often do. Battle was not an interruption of normal existence. It was one of its possibilities. This awareness shaped expectations from childhood onward. People learned early that stability was temporary, that safety depended on forces beyond their control. This did not make them despairing, it made them practical. Practicality defined survival. Men learned to read each other quickly, to trust those who had proven steady under pressure. Reputation mattered because it was often all one had. A man known to panic endangered everyone. A man known to hold firm inspired confidence even when hope was thin. These reputations followed people long after battles ended, shaping marriages, alliances, and social standing. Even those who never fought were shaped by battles indirectly. Taxes rose to fund armies. Labor was demanded to repair walls or roads. Food shortages followed campaigns like shadows. The absence of men altered family structures and inheritance patterns. War reshaped society not through spectacle, but through accumulation, small changes stacking year after year. Over time, medieval communities developed a kind of emotional economy around war. Grief was shared but limited. Mourning had boundaries, not because loss was insignificant, but because endless mourning made survival impossible. Rituals compressed sorrow into manageable forms, anniversaries were marked, names were spoken. Then life pressed forward again. There was also a quiet understanding that memory could be dangerous. Dwelling too deeply on battle invited despair or rage. Many survivors chose not to speak unless asked, and often not even then. Silence was not forgetfulness, it was protection. What could not be changed did not always need to be revisited. And yet some memories demanded release. Confession offered one path. Pilgrimage offered another. Men walked long distances after wars, visiting shrines not just out of devotion, but out of need to put space between themselves and what they had done, what they had seen. Movement helped when stillness became unbearable. As centuries turned, armor styles changed, tactics evolved, and new weapons appeared, but the core experience of battle shifted little. Whether behind a shield wall or a pike formation, the human body remained the same. Fear still tightened the chest. Fatigue still dulled reactions. Courage still meant acting while afraid. Technology altered how death arrived, not what it felt like. Modern distance tempts us to see medieval battles as simpler, less devastating than later wars. But simplicity does not mean gentleness. Close combat compressed terror into intimate moments. Death was not abstract. It had weight, sound, resistance. It required effort. This effort left marks not only on bodies, but on conscience. In the end, medieval battles endured in history, not because they were unique, but because they were representative. They showed, again and again, what happens when human beings are placed in systems that reward force and offer few alternatives. They showed how societies normalize violence while simultaneously struggling to survive it. So when we strip away the banners, the songs, the painted manuscripts, and the heroic language, what remains is something quieter and more honest. A field, men standing shoulder to shoulder, fear pressing in from all sides. The decision to move forward anyway, the collapse of order, the long, aching aftermath. What actually happened in a medieval battle was not a story meant to inspire awe. It was an experience meant to be endured. And those who endured it did not come away as legends. They came away changed, carrying fragments of the battlefield into every ordinary day that followed. As those fragments were carried forward, they subtly reshaped how people understood themselves and the world around them. A man who had stood in a battle knew, in his bones, how fragile order truly was. He had seen structure dissolve in moments, watched confidence turn to panic, discipline to flight. This knowledge did not make him wise in a philosophical sense, but it made him cautious. Promises sounded different to him. Threats felt more real, authority seemed less absolute. This quiet skepticism spread through communities over time. Medieval society outwardly emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and divine order, yet beneath that surface was a lived understanding that power could collapse violently and without warning. A lord might command loyalty one year and be dead the next. A banner that inspired fear today might lie trampled tomorrow. People learned to adapt quickly, to hedge their trust, to survive change. Battles also shaped how medieval people thought about death itself. Death was not distant or abstract. It was familiar, personal, and often sudden. Seeing it repeatedly stripped it of some mystery, but not its weight. Many soldiers developed a practical relationship with mortality. They'd prepared for it, made peace with it when they could, and continued living not because they believed they were safe, but because life persisted until it did not. This attitude filtered into everyday customs. Wills were made early. Marriages happened young. Prayers for the dead were constant. These were not signs of obsession, but of acceptance. Medieval people understood that certainty was rare, and time was fragile. For all its brutality, battle also revealed cooperation under extreme pressure. Survival depended on others holding their place, raising shields together, sharing space and risk. Even men who disliked one another learned to rely on each other implicitly. This created bonds that could last a lifetime. Veterans often sought each other out later, drawn by a shared understanding that required no explanation. At the same time, battle exposed inequality sharply. Nobles could be ransomed. Common soldiers could not. Armor and status saved some lives while others were deemed expendable. This reality was not lost on those who fought. Resentment simmered quietly, sometimes erupting years later in rebellions or social unrest. The battlefield did not create these tensions, but it sharpened them. As medieval warfare continued, so did attempts to impose meaning upon it. Laws of chivalry, codes of conduct, and religious justifications multiplied. These were sincere efforts to humanize something inherently inhumane. Sometimes they worked, limiting excess. Often they failed, swept aside by fear and fury. But their existence mattered. They showed an ongoing struggle to reconcile values with violence. When people today imagine medieval battles, they often imagine certainty, clear sides, clear causes, clear outcomes. The reality was ambiguity. Men fought without fully understanding why. They survived without knowing how. They returned home unsure of what it meant. Meaning was constructed afterward, carefully, imperfectly, and still, life went on. Crops were planted where bodies had fallen. Children grew up playing near old scars in the land. Songs were sung that turned chaos into story. This was not denial. It was continuity. The world could not stop for every tragedy, no matter how great. In the end, what actually happened in a medieval battle was not contained within the clash itself. It spread outward like ripples, touching everything it encountered: families, fields, beliefs, futures. It shaped generations who never held a weapon just as deeply as those who did. A medieval battle was not a moment frozen in time. It was a process beginning long before the first blow and ending only when its last consequences faded, often centuries later. And even then, traces remained, embedded in the way people spoke of courage, fear, duty, and survival. That is the reality behind the myths. Not glory, not destiny, but endurance. A long human endurance in the face of violence that was never fully understood, never fully controlled, and never truly forgotten. Eventually, even the memory of individual battles blurred into a continuum of hardship, endurance, and quiet heroism that rarely made it into songs or chronicles. Names were forgotten, banners decayed, armor rusted, and weapons crumbled. Fields that had been soaked with blood returned to grass. Villages rebuilt themselves over scars in the earth. Yet the lessons, the human truths remained, woven into society like hidden threads. The fragility of order, the necessity of cooperation, the resilience of the living, the weight of fear, and the subtle, persistent presence of loss. For those who survived, life after battle was rarely triumphant. Victory brought responsibility, not celebration. Defeat brought work, endurance, and survival against long odds. Most people returned to ordinary tasks: farming, raising families, maintaining roads and fortifications, tending animals. And yet, in every small decision, how to plant a field, where to build a home, whom to trust, echoes of battle lingered. The lessons were practical, passed quietly from one generation to the next, shaping society more than any chronicled heroics ever could. And for the generations that followed, the battlefield became both a warning and a guide. Stories simplified fear into courage, chaos into order, death into honor, but underneath those tales lay the inescapable truth: survival required endurance, discipline, and humanity in the face of unrelenting violence. Life itself was fragile, and every choice carried consequence. So what actually happened in a medieval battle was not a series of grand cinematic moments. It was the slow accumulation of preparation, the confusion and terror of engagement, the physical and mental strain of fighting, the desperate struggle to survive, and the long, quiet aftermath that shaped soldiers, civilians, and society itself. It was ordinary men and women confronted with extraordinary circumstances, doing what they could to endure, adapt, and move forward. The battles themselves passed, but their effects rippled through time, shaping the medieval world and leaving traces that lingered long after the last sword was sheathed. In the end, the true story of a medieval battle is a story of humanity, its fear, its courage, its suffering, and its resilience. It is not a story of legend or glory. It is a story of endurance, and that endurance is what allowed life to continue even in a world built on the constant shadow of war. And that is the reality behind the medieval battlefield, the truth buried beneath myth, yet alive in every heartbeat that faced it and every life that continued afterward.